Story 1. Shadows of the Past. I often walked with my Uncle Joe through the woods behind our house. One evening we paused by an old well, the kind with crumbling stones and a rusty iron cover. Uncle Joe was quiet, staring into the dark depths. He started talking about my father, who had died when I was young. His voice carried a weight that made the air feel heavy. He said some stories were better left untold. I felt a chill and didn't push for more, but his words stuck with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went into the study and started looking through my father's old books. As I pulled one off the shelf, an old folded map slipped out. The edges were worn, the ink faded. It showed a spot deep in the woods, somewhere I had never explored. My curiosity flared. I knew I had to find that place. The next day, I followed the map. The forest felt different, as if it were holding its breath. I pushed through thick underbrush until I came to a clearing. There, hidden behind tangled branches, was a small cabin. It looked abandoned, the roof sagging, the windows cracked. I stepped closer and pushed open the door. The hinges groaned, and inside it was dark and cold. On the wall were old photographs. They showed my father with another boy, around the same age. I'd never seen these pictures before, and the boy was a stranger to me. My heart pounded as I stared at them, questions bubbling in my mind. That evening I asked my mother about the photos. Her face turned pale, and she seemed to shrink before my eyes. She looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "You had a brother," she said. "He disappeared before you were born." I felt my stomach twist. No one had ever mentioned a brother. I couldn't let it rest. Over the next few days, I searched records, old documents, anything that could tell me more. But there was nothing. No birth certificate. No mention of a disappearance. It was like he had never existed. Frustration gnawed at me. I needed answers, and I knew only one person could give them to me. I confronted Uncle Joe. We were in the living room. I could hear the clock ticking. My heart beat loud in my ears. I pressed him, my voice raw. He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. He admitted it then. My brother had died in an accident. Uncle Joe had been there, and he blamed himself. The family had decided to keep it all a secret, to spare themselves the pain. The truth felt like a punch to the gut, but I insisted that we needed to talk about it as a family. We gathered in the living room. My mother clutched a tissue, her eyes red. Uncle Joe sat with his shoulders slumped. There were tears, anger, apologies, but there was also relief. The silence had only made the pain worse. Finally, talking about it brought a sense of release. A few days later, I decided to return to the cabin. This time, I wanted to see if there were any other clues there, something I might have missed. I went alone, the cold autumn wind biting at my face. When I reached the cabin, I noticed a trap door in the corner of the floor, half hidden beneath a rotting rug. My heart skipped a beat as I knelt down and pulled it open. It revealed a narrow set of stairs leading into darkness. I took a deep breath and descended. The air was musty, thick with the scent of earth and decay. At the bottom was a small cellar, barely more than a hole in the ground. There were old crates stacked along the walls, and in one corner, a small wooden chest. I opened the chest, and inside were more photographs, along with a few personal items, a toy car, a child's drawing, and a worn-out teddy bear. My eyes stung with tears. These must have belonged to my brother. I could feel the weight of his presence, a childhood lost in the dark corners of the family's memory. I brought the items back home, and that night, we went through them together as a family. My mother held the teddy bear to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Uncle Joe picked up the drawing, a crude sketch of a house with two stick-figure boys standing out front. "He used to love drawing," Uncle Joe said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first time he had spoken openly about my brother, and I could see the pain and the love in his eyes. The following weekend, I decided to learn more about the cabin itself. I visited the town library and spoke with the librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Halloway. She remembered the cabin. "It was built by your grandfather," she said. He used it as a retreat, but after the tragedy, no one went back there. She looked at me with a kind but knowing gaze. Sometimes the past has a way of staying with a place, she added. Her words only deepened my resolve to understand everything about what had happened. One night, Uncle Joe invited me out for another walk through the woods. The air was crisp, the stars shining brightly above us. He was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. You know, I tried to move on, he said, but every time I see you and Lily, I think about him, about what could have been. His voice broke, and I could see the tears glistening in his eyes. I made a terrible mistake, and I've had to live with it every day since. But I hope, maybe now, we can start to heal. I nodded, understanding the weight he carried. I knew it wasn't just Uncle Joe who needed to heal. It was all of us. The more I learned, the more I realized that my brother's memory wasn't something to be hidden away. It was a part of our family, a part that needed to be acknowledged and cherished. The next week, we decided to do something to honor my brother's memory. As a family, we gathered at the cabin. We cleaned it up, clearing the branches and ivy that had grown wild around it. My mother brought flowers, placing them by the door, while Uncle Joe repaired the broken windows. It was our way of making peace, of turning a place of hidden sorrow into something meaningful. Together, we planted a small tree near the cabin, a new beginning, something that would grow and thrive, just as we hoped to do as a family. One afternoon, as Lily and I sat on the porch, she took my hand. "We're still family," she said. And she was right. The secrets had changed everything, but they hadn't broken us. The love we shared was still there, stronger for the truth we had finally uncovered. The map, now worn and creased, stayed on my desk. It was a reminder of where the search for the truth had taken me. The cabin still stood, a quiet testament to all that had been hidden. I visited it sometimes, not for answers, but just to be close to the brother I never got to meet. The pictures on the wall now felt like a part of my story, a connection that, despite everything, held us all together. With time, the cabin became a place we visited often. We painted it, fixed the roof, and even added a bench outside where we could sit and reflect. It was no longer just a relic of the past, but a place where we could gather, share stories, and remember. It became a symbol of the resilience of our family, of our ability to face the darkness and find light on the other side. The cabin, once abandoned and forgotten, now stood as a beacon of hope and remembrance, a place where the past and present could coexist in peace. Story 2. The Hidden Chamber. I remember that Saturday morning vividly. My younger sister Lily and I were in the kitchen, preparing breakfast like we often did when visiting our grandparents' farmhouse. The morning sun filtered through the window, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the room. We laughed, flipping pancakes and teasing each other about who made the better batter. While reaching for a mixing bowl in the lower cabinet, I noticed a loose floorboard beneath the sink. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but something about it caught my eye. Looking back, that moment was the first step towards unraveling our family's secrets. After breakfast, I waited until Lily had gone outside to help Grandpa in the garden. I knelt on the cool tile, pressing against the edges of the loose board. There was slight resistance, and a musty scent filled my nostrils as I pried it open. Beneath the board lay an old key wrapped in a faded red ribbon. The key was cool, heavy, and etched with delicate patterns. Later that day, as I wandered the halls, I noticed a door at the end of an unused corridor. Dust particles danced in the beams of sunlight, and the air smelled of old books. I approached the door, heart pounding, and slipped the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door creaked open, revealing a small study. The room held antique furniture, a heavy desk, a worn chair, shelves lined with books. On the wall was a portrait of a woman who resembled my mother. A chill ran down my spine. On the desk lay a diary, its leather cover cracked. I opened it, revealing pages dated over 30 years ago, written by someone named Amelia. I spent hours reading. Amelia wrote about her life in the farmhouse, her love for a man I assumed was my grandfather, and about giving birth to twins and being forced to give one up. The handwriting grew more erratic, the words filled with pain. I felt her anguish as if it were my own. That evening, I approached my grandmother with the diary. My hands trembled as I held it out to her. Grandma's eyes met mine, and for a long moment she simply stared at the book. Finally, she took it, her fingers brushing the worn leather. "Amelia was my sister," she whispered. "Your mother is Amelia's daughter, one of the twins. We hid it because it was a different time, Emily. Your grandfather thought it was best." Her words hung in the air. I might have an unknown aunt, or even a twin. The thought made my world shift, my sense of identity slipping away. I couldn't rest until I knew the truth. The next few days, I searched online records and visited the town's archive, piecing together a story hidden for decades. I sifted through old newspaper clippings, their edges brittle, the smell of the archive room clinging to my clothes. I learned about Amelia, her love, and the circumstances of the twins' separation. One afternoon, I found an article in the archive mentioning Amelia and a mysterious disappearance. The story was vague, filled with speculation, but spoke of a tragedy covered up quickly. The hidden history weighed on me, a burden my family had carried for years. I returned to the study searching for more. Behind a row of dusty books, I found another hidden compartment. Inside was a faded photograph, two infants in the arms of a woman who looked like Amelia. My chest tightened. The twins. One was my mother, but who was the other? I confronted Uncle Mike, my mother's brother. When I brought up Amelia and the photograph, his face changed, anger mixed with panic. He told me to let it go, that some secrets were better left buried. His reaction only made me more determined. The more I dug, the clearer the truth became. I was the twin Amelia had given up. My parents adopted me, raising me alongside Lily. The resemblance to the woman in the portrait, the key, the diary, all pointed to this truth. I told Lily one evening, the two of us sitting on the porch. She didn't say anything at first, just took my hand. "We've always been sisters," she said. "This doesn't change that." Her words soothed me. We sat there for a long time, watching the sky, silent but understanding. The farmhouse seemed different, warmer, more alive. I spent more time with Grandma, listening to her stories. She spoke of Amelia more often, her eyes distant but her voice steady. Lily and I continued our routines, the laughter easier now, unburdened by the unknown. One afternoon, I returned Amelia's diary to the desk. The portrait of the woman was no longer a stranger, but family. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the past settle into something I could carry without fear. As I closed the door to the study, the key still warm in my hand, I knew this was not an ending, but a beginning. A new chapter built on truth, understanding, and the unbreakable bond between sisters. Story 3, Echoes of the Attic. It was a rainy day when I visited Aunt Clara, and we decided to tackle the attic cleanup we had been putting off for years. The rain drummed steadily on the roof, making the attic feel even cozier as we sifted through old boxes and bags, uncovering the bits and pieces of family history stored away. Aunt Clara shared stories as we worked, her laughter echoing in the small, dusty space. She talked about our grandparents, distant relatives, and family secrets, the kind that make you smile or shake your head. While moving a stack of old quilts, I noticed an antique trunk pushed against the far wall. It was dark, scratched with age, and had ornate brass fittings. Aunt Clara hesitated when I pointed it out. "Oh, that old thing? Best leave it be," she said, quickly moving to another pile of boxes. But something about the trunk drew me in. Her reluctance only made me more curious. That moment, standing there staring at the old trunk, marked the beginning of a journey into our family's shadowed past. As Aunt Clara busied herself with some books, I continued to explore the attic, my mind still on the trunk. Among the random knickknacks, I found an old teapot on a shelf. It was heavy, and when I shook it, something rattled inside. I opened the lid and found a small rusted key, wrapped carefully in a bit of cloth. I glanced at Aunt Clara, but she was engrossed in a dusty photo album. The key felt cool in my palm, and I knew it belonged to that trunk. I moved to the trunk, hesitating for only a moment before fitting the key into the lock. It clicked open easily, and the lid creaked as I lifted it. Inside, there were neatly bundled letters, yellowed with age, and tied with a faded ribbon. They were addressed to my grandfather, each envelope bearing the name Beatrice. I flipped through the letters, my heart pounding as I read snippets of words, affectionate phrases, longing and love that was never spoken of in our family. My grandfather had carried on a secret relationship, one that Aunt Clara clearly knew about but had chosen to keep hidden. I kept digging, moving aside the letters until I found an old cigar box beneath them. It was filled with photographs, grainy, black and white images of a boy. He looked around 8 or 9, with a smile so familiar it sent a shiver down my spine. He looked like me. I turned to Aunt Clara, holding up one of the photos. Her face went pale, and she put down the album, her hands trembling slightly. She sighed deeply, finally coming to sit beside me. "It's time you knew the truth," she said. "The boy in the photographs," she explained, "was my half-brother, my grandfather's son from his affair with Beatrice. The family had given him up for adoption to avoid scandal, and no one had spoken of him since. The weight of her words settled over me, and I felt an emptiness I couldn't quite explain. A part of my family, a part of me, had been lost. I knew I had to find him. Over the next few weeks, I poured myself into the search. I spent hours digging through public records, adoption documents, and even hired a private investigator. The process was exhausting, filled with dead ends and false hopes. Each time I uncovered a new clue, my excitement would flare, only to be quickly extinguished by another setback. Aunt Clara was hesitant but supportive, helping where she could, her guilt clear each time she spoke of the past. Then finally, I found him. His name was Thomas, and he lived just a few hours away. The first time I saw him, it felt like looking into a mirror. We were twins. Not just similar, identical. The shock of it took my breath away. We met at a small cafe halfway between our towns. The moment our eyes met, I saw the same mix of emotions in his eyes that I felt. Joy, fear, confusion. We spoke for hours, sharing stories, comparing our lives. It was strange how much we had in common despite the years apart. Meeting Thomas was like finding a piece of myself that I hadn't known was missing. We talked about the past, about Beatrice, and our grandfather. Thomas had always known he was adopted, but he never knew the full story. Together, we began piecing together what we could, filling in the blanks of our shared history. The attic felt different the next time I visited. Aunt Clara joined me as we sorted through the rest of the trunk. The secrets no longer felt like weights holding us down. Instead, they were stories, parts of who we were, things that brought us closer. Clara smiled more easily now, the tension in her shoulders gone. We decided to keep the photographs and letters, to preserve the memory of Beatrice and the brother I had found. Thomas and I started visiting each other regularly. We were strangers, yet not. There was a bond between us, a connection that had always been there, waiting to be found. As I stood in the attic with Aunt Clara, I realized that the trunk, the letters, the photographs, they had opened a door, not just to the past, but to a future where our family could finally be whole again, secrets and all. Story 4. The Whispering Well. When I was a child, the old well in our backyard was a source of fascination. I can still picture it. The moss-covered stones, the rusty iron cover, the way it seemed to almost hum with an eerie presence. My parents were clear. I was not to go near it. They said it was dangerous, the stones loose, the water deep. But it wasn't just the well's precarious state that kept me away. It was the whispers. Sometimes, when I played nearby, I would hear faint voices coming from its depths. I told my parents, but they dismissed it as my imagination, a child's wild story. Eventually, I convinced myself they were right, that the whispers were nothing but a trick of my young mind. Years passed, and the well faded from my memory, relegated to the strange recollections of childhood. That is, until I returned home as an adult, visiting my parents after years away. The old house felt familiar, the scent of my mother's cooking wafting through the halls, the creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't long before I found myself drawn to the backyard. The well stood there just as I remembered it, untouched by time. The moment I approached, a chill ran down my spine, and I heard them again, the whispers. Faint, almost like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but unmistakable. My heart pounded, a sense of unease settling in my chest. I mentioned the well to my parents over dinner, expecting them to laugh it off, but their reaction caught me off guard. My mother's smile faltered, and my father quickly changed the subject, his voice strained. The air in the room shifted, a tension I couldn't quite place. In the following days, I noticed other odd behaviors. My parents avoided the backyard, my father's hand trembled when I brought up the well again, and even my younger brother, who had always been so curious, grew quiet when I mentioned it. It was as if the well cast a shadow over our family, something unspoken yet deeply understood. Determined to uncover the truth, I began searching through the attic, a place filled with relics of our family history, old photographs, dusty books, and boxes filled with forgotten keepsakes. It was there, in a box beneath piles of yellowed newspapers, that I found documents that made my blood run cold. Records of family members, aunts, uncles, distant cousins, all of whom had disappeared. Each of their names marked with the same note: last seen near the well. My heart raced as I read through the papers, piecing together a pattern that spanned generations. The well wasn't just dangerous, it was something far worse. One evening, unable to bear the weight of my discoveries alone, I confronted my parents. We sat in the living room, the lights dim, the air thick with tension. They exchanged a long look before my mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me about the well, how it had been in our family for centuries, how it required sacrifices to protect us. The whispers, she said, they're not just voices, they're demands. My father looked away, his face lined with grief. They had done what they believed they had to keep us safe, to ensure the family's prosperity. The disappearances, the whispers, they were all part of a pact, a tradition passed down and upheld no matter the cost. I felt a chill settle over me, the weight of their words pressing down. The well demanded sacrifices, and my parents had complied. But now it was my turn. The choice lay before me: continue the tradition, or break the cycle and face whatever consequences might come. I couldn't sleep that night, the whispers growing louder in my mind, echoing through the house, wrapping around me like a shroud. The next morning, I made my decision. I couldn't allow this cycle to continue, couldn't let another life be lost to the shadows of our family's past. I went to the well with a sledgehammer, my hands trembling as I lifted it above my head. The first strike was deafening, the sound reverberating through the backyard. I brought the hammer down again and again, stones cracking, dust filling the air. The whispers grew frantic, rising in pitch until they were almost screams. My parents watched from the kitchen window, their faces pale, fear etched in their eyes. When the well finally collapsed, there was a moment of silence, an eerie, unnatural stillness that made the hair on my neck stand on end. And then, something shifted. The air grew colder, the sky darkened, and I felt a pressure building, as if the very earth beneath me was holding its breath. The protective barrier my family had maintained for generations was broken, and with it, something had been unleashed. In the following days, strange things began happening. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Whispers echoed through the house even when I was nowhere near the well. My parents grew more withdrawn, their eyes hollow, as if they knew what was coming, but couldn't bring themselves to speak of it. I realized too late that dismantling the well hadn't freed us. It had only released whatever had been trapped, whatever had been kept at bay by those sacrifices. The well was gone, but the danger remained, now unbound and angry. The whispers no longer came from the depths of the earth. They were everywhere, surrounding us, a constant reminder of the price of defiance. And as I lay awake at night, the house creaking around me, I understood that this was far from over. The cycle hadn't ended. It had only just begun again, in a different form, and I had no idea how to stop it.